Anti Federalist number 5, Scotland and England, a case in point. The ongoing Federalist essays appeared from 1787 to May of 1788. Okay. I would beg leave to remark that Publius, the signer of the previous Federalist Papers, has been very unfortunate in selecting these extracts as a case in point to convince the people of America of the benefits they would derive from a union under such a government as would be affected by the new system. It is certainty that when the union was the subject of debate in the Scottish legislature, some of their most sensible and disinterested nobles, as well as commoners who were not corrupted by English gold, violently opposed the union and predicted that the people of Scotland would, in fact, derive no advantages from a consolidation of government with England, but, on the contrary, they would bear a great proportion of her debt and furnish large bodies of men to assist in her wars with France, with whom, before the Union, Scotland was at all times on terms of the most cordial amenity. It was also predicted that the representation in the Parliament of Great Britain, particularly in the House of Commons, was too small, 45 members being very far from the proportion of Scotland, when its extent and numbers were duly considered, and that even they, being so few, might, or at the least a majority of them might, at all times be immediately under the influence of the English ministry, and, of course, very little of their attention would be given to the true interest of their constituents, especially if they came in competition with the prospects of views of the ministry. How far these predictions have been verified, I believe it will not require much trouble to prove. It must be obvious to everyone, the least acquainted with English history, that since the union of the two nations, the great body of the people of Scotland are in as much worse a situation now than they would be were they a separate nation. This will be fully illustrated by attending to the great emigrations which are made to America. For if the people could have but a common support at home, it is unreasonable to suppose that such large numbers would quit their country, break from their tender ties of kindred and friendship, and trust themselves on a dangerous voyage across a vast ocean to a country of which they can know but very little except by common report. I will further remark that it is not about 2 or 3 years since a member of the British Parliament, I believe Mr. Dempster, gave a most pathetic description of the sufferings of the commonalty of Scotland, particularly on the seacoast, and endeavored to call the attention of Parliament to their distresses and afford them some relief by encouraging their fisheries. It deserves also to be remembered that the people of Scotland, in the late war between France and Great Britain, petitioned to have arms and ammunition supplied them by their general government for their defense, alleging that they were incapable of defending themselves and their property from an invasion unless they were assisted by government. It is a truth that their petitions were disregarded and reasons were assigned, that it would be dangerous to entrust them with the means of defense, as they would then have it in their power to break the Union. From this representation of the situation of Scotland, surely no one can draw any conclusion that this country would derive happiness or security from a government which would, in reality, give the people but the mere name of being free. For if the representation stipulated by the Constitution, framed by the late Convention, be attentively and dispassionately considered, it must be obvious to every disinterested observer, besides many other weighty objections which will present themselves to view, that the number is not, by any means, adequate to the present inhabitants of this extensive continent, which less to those it will contain at a future period. I observe that the writer above mentioned takes great pains to show the disadvantages which would result from 3 or 4 distinct confederacies of these states. I must confess that I have not seen, in any of the pieces published against the opposed Constitution, anything which gives the most distant idea that their writers are in favor of such governments. But it is clear these objections arise from a consolidation not affording security for the liberties of their country, and from hence it must evidently appear that the design of Publius, in artificially holding up to the public view the bugbear of such confederacies, can be with so other intention than wilfully to deceive his fellow citizens. I am confident it must be, and that it is, the sincere wish of every true friend of the United States that there should be a confederated national government, but that it should be one which would have control over national and external matters only, and interfere with the internal regulations and police of the different states of the Union. Such a government, while it would give us respectability abroad, would not encroach upon or subvert our liberties at home. Federalist number 5. The same subject continued, concerning dangers from foreign force and influence. To the people of the state of New York, Queen Anne, in her letter of the 1st of July, 1706, to the Scotch Parliament, makes some observations on the importance of the Union then forming between England and Scotland, which merit our attention. I shall present the public with 1 or 2 extracts from it. An entire and perfect union would be the solid foundation of lasting peace. It will secure your religion, liberty, and prosperity, remove the animosities amongst yourselves, and the jealousies and differences betwixt our 2 kingdoms. It must increase your strength, riches, and trade, and by this union, the whole island, being joined in affection and free from all apprehensions of different interest, will be enabled to resist all its enemies. We must earnestly recommend to you calmness and unanimity in this great and weighty affair, that the union may be brought to a happy conclusion, being the only effectual way to secure our present and future happiness, and disappoint the designs of our and your enemies, who will doubtless on this occasion use their utmost endeavors to prevent or delay this union. It was remarked in the preceding paper that weakness and divisions at home would invite dangers from abroad, and that nothing would tend more to secure us from them than union, strength, and good government within ourselves. This subject is copious and cannot easily be exhausted. The history of Great Britain is the one with which we are in general the best acquainted, and it gives us many useful lessons. We may profit by their experience without paying the price for which it costs them. Although it seems obvious to common sense that the people of such an island should be but one nation, yet we find that they are for ages divided into three, and that those three were almost consistently embroiled in quarrels and wars with one another. Notwithstanding, their true interest with respect to the continental nations was really the same, yet by the arts and policy and practices of those nations, their mutual jealousies were perpetually kept inflamed, and for a long series of years they were far more inconvenient and troublesome than they were useful and assisting to each other. Should the people of America divide themselves into 3 or 4 nations, would not the same thing happen? Would not similar jealousies arise and be in like manner cherished, instead of their being joined in affection and free from all apprehension of different interests? Envy and jealousy would soon extinguish confidence and affection, and the partial interests of each confederacy, instead of the general interests of all America, would be the only objects of their policy and pursuits. Hence, like most other bordering nations, they would always be either involved in disputes and war or live in the constant apprehension of them. The most sanguine advocates for 3 or 4 confederacies cannot reasonably suppose that they would long remain exactly on an equal footing in point of strength, even if it was possible to form them so at first. But admitting that to be practicable, yet what human contrivance can secure the continuance of such equality, independent of those local circumstances which tend to beget and increase power in one part and to impede its progress in another? We must advert to the effects of that superior policy and good management which would probably distinguish the government of one above the rest, and by which their relative equality in strength and consideration would be destroyed. For it cannot be presumed that the same degree of sound policy, prudence, and foresight would not uniformly be observed by each of these confederacies for a long concession of years. Whenever, and from whatever causes, it might happen, and happen it would, that any one of these nations or confederacies should rise on the scale of political importance much above the degree of her neighbors, that moment would those neighbors behold her with envy and with fear. Both these passions would lead them to countenance, if not to promote, whatever might promise to diminish her importance, and would also restrain them from measures calculated to advance or even to secure her prosperity. Much time would not be necessary to enable her to discern these unfriendly dispositors. Naturally creates distrust, and by nothing is goodwill and kind conduct more speedily changed than by invidious jealousies and uncandid imputations, whether expressed or implied. The North is generally the region of strength, and many local circumstances render it probable that the most northern of the proposed confederacies would, at a period not very distant, be unquestionably more formidable than any of the others. No sooner would this become evident than the northern hive would excite the same ideas and sensations in the more southern parts of America, which it formerly did in the southern parts of Europe. Nor does it appear to be rash conjecture that its young swarms might often be tempted to gather money and the more blooming fields and milder air of their luxuries and more delicate neighbors. They who well consider the history of similar divisions and confederacies will find abundant reason to apprehend that those in contemplation in no other sense would be neighbors than as they would be borderers, that they would neither love nor trust one another, but on the contrary would be a prey to discord, jealousy, and mutual injuries. In short, they would place us exactly in the situation in which some nations doubtless wish to see us in, viz., formidable only to each other. From these considerations, it appears that those gentlemen are greatly mistaken who suppose that alliances offensive and defensive might be formed between these confederacies, and would produce that combination and union of wills and arms and of resource which would be necessary to put and keep them in formidable state of defense against foreign enemies. When did the independent states, into which Britain and Spain were formed, divided, combine in such alliance, or unite their forces against a foreign enemy? The proposed confederacies will be distinct nations. Each of them would have its commerce and foreigners to regulate by distinct treaties, and as their productions and commodities are different and proper for different markets, so would those treaties be essentially different. Different commercial concerns must create different interests, and of course different degrees of political attachment and connection with different foreign nations. Hence, it might and probably would happen that the foreign nation with whom the Southern Confederacy might be at war would be the one with whom the Northern Confederacy would be the most desirous in preserving peace and friendship. An alliance so contrary to their immediate interests would not therefore be easy to form, nor, if formed, would it be observed and fulfilled with perfect good faith. Nay, it is far more probable that in America, as in Europe, neighboring nations, acting under the impulse of opposite interests and unfriendly passions, would frequently be found taking different sides. Considering our distance from Europe, it would be more natural for these confederacies to apprehend danger from one another than from distant nations, and therefore that each of them should be more desirous to guard against the others by the aid of foreign alliances than to guard against foreign dangers by alliances between themselves. And here let us not forget how much more easy it is to receive foreign fleets into our ports and foreign armies into our countries than it is to persuade or compel them to depart. How many conquests did the Romans and others make in the characters of allies, and what innovations did they, under the same character, introduce into the governments of those whom they pretended to protect? The candid men judged then whether the division of America into any given number of independent sovereignties would tend to secure us against the hostilities, improper interference from foreign nations. Anti Federalist number 6. The Hobgoblins of Anarchy and the Dissensions among the States. One of the largest series of anti-federalist essays was penned under the pseudonym Sentinel, and this is one of his. The evils of anarchy have been portrayed with all the imaginary imagery of language and the growing colors of eloquence. The affrighted mind is thence led to clasp the new Constitution as the instrument of deliverance, as the only avenue to safety and happiness. To avoid the possible and transitory evils of one extreme, it is seduced into the certain and permanent misery necessarily attendant on the other. A state of anarchy is from its very nature, can never be of long continuance. The greater its violence, the shorter the duration. Order and security are immediately sought by the distracted people beneath the shelter of equal laws and the salutary restraints of regular government. And if this be not attainable, absolute power is assumed by the one, or a few, who shall be the most enterprising and successful. If anarchy, therefore, were the inevitable consequence of rejecting the new Constitution, it would be infinitely better to incur it, for even that there would be at least the chance of a good government rising out of licentiousness. But to rush at once into despotism, because there is a bare possibility of anarchy ensuing from the rejection, or from what is yet more visionary, the small delay that would be occasioned by a revision and correction of the proposed system of government, is so superlatively weak, so fatally blind, that it is astonishing any person of common understanding should suffer an imposition to have the least influence on his judgment. Still more astonishing that so flimsy and deceptive a doctrine should make converts among the enlightened freemen of America, who have so long enjoyed the blessings of liberty. But when I view among such converts men otherwise preeminent, it raises a blush for the weakness of humanity, that these, her brightest ornaments, should be so diminished to what is self-evident to most men, that such imbecility of judgment should appear where so much perfection was looked for. This ought to teach us to depend more on our own judgment and the nature of the case than upon the opinions of the greatest and the best of men, who, from constitutional infirmities or particular situations, may sometimes view an object, though a delusive medium, but the opinions of great men are more frequently the dictates of ambition or private interest. The source of the apprehensions of this so much dreaded anarchy would, upon investigation, be found to arise from the artful suggestions of designing men, and not from rational probability grounded on the actual state of affairs. The least reflection is sufficient to detect the fallacy, to show that there is no one circumstance to justify the prediction of such an event. On the contrary, a short-term will evince to the utter dismay and confusion of the conspirators that a perseverance in cramming down their scheme of power upon the freemen of this state, Pennsylvania, will inevitably produce an anarchy destructive of their daring domination, and may kindle a flame prejudicial to their safety. They should be cautious not to trespass too far on the forbearance of freemen when resting their dearest concerns, but prudently retreat from the gathering storm. The other specter that has been raised to terrify and alarm the people out of the exercise of their judgment on this great occasion is the dread of our splitting into separate confederacies or republics, that might become rival powers and consequently liable to mutual wars from the usual motives of contention. This is an event still more improbable than the foregoing. It is a presumption unwarranted either by the situation of affairs or the sentiments of the people, no disposition leading to it exists. The advocates of the new Constitution seem to view such a separation with horror, and its opponents are strenuously contending for a confederation that shall embrace all America under its comprehensive and salutary protection. This hobgoblin appears to have sprung from the deranged brains of Publius, the Federalist, a New York writer who, mistaking sound for argument, has with Herculean labor accumulated myriads of unmeaning sentences and mechanically endeavored to force conviction by a torrent of misplaced words. He might have spared his readers the fatigue of wading through his long-winded disquisitions on the direful effects of the contentions of inimical states, as totally inapplicable to the subject he was professedly treating. This writer has devoted much time and wasted more paper in combating chimeras of his own creation. However, for the sake of argument, I will admit that the necessary consequences of rejecting or delaying the establishment of the new Constitution would be the dissolution of the Union and the institution of even rival and inimical republics. Yet ought such an apprehension, if well founded, to drive us into the fangs of despotism? Infinitely preferable would be occasional wars to such an event. The former, although a severe scourge, is transient in its continuance, and in its operation partial, but a small portion of the community are exposed to its greatest horrors, and yet fewer experience its greatest evils. The latter is permanent and universal misery, without remission or exemption. The passing clouds obscure for a time the splendor of the sun, so do wars interrupt the welfare of mankind. But despotism is a settled gloom that totally extinguishes happiness. Not a ray of comfort can penetrate to cheer the dejected mind. The goad of power, with unabating rigor, insists upon the utmost exaction. Like a merciless taskmaster, it is continually inflicting the lash, and is never satiated with the feast of unfeeling domination or the most abject servility. The celebrated Lord Kames, whose disquisitions of human nature evidence extraordinary strength of judgment and depth of investigation, says that a continual civil war, which is the most destructive and horrible scene of human discord, is preferable to the uniformity of wretchedness and misery attendant upon despotism. Of all possible evils, as I observed in my first number, this is the worst and the most to be dreaded. I congratulate my fellow citizens that a good government, the greatest earthly blessing, may be so easily obtained, that our circumstances are so favorable that nothing but the folly of the conspirators can produce anarchy or civil war, which would permanently terminate in their destruction and the permanent harmony of the state, alone interrupted by their ambitious mechanizations. Federalist number 6, concerning dangers from dissensions between the states. This one was written by Alexander Hamilton. To the people of the state of New York, the 3 last numbers of this paper have been dedicated to an enumeration of the dangers to which we should be exposed in a state of disunion from the arms and arts of foreign nations. I shall now proceed to delineate dangers of a different and perhaps still more alarming kind, those which will, in all probability, flow from dissensions between the states themselves, and from the domestic factions and convulsions. These have been already in some instances slightly anticipated, but they deserve a more particular and more full investigation. A man must be far gone in utopian speculations who can seriously doubt that, if these states should either be wholly disunited or only united in partial confederacies, the subdivisions into which they might be thrown would have frequent and violent contests with each other. To presume a want of motives for such contests as an argument against their existence would be to forget that men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. To look for a continuation of harmony between a number of independent, unconnected sovereignties in the same neighborhood would be to disregard the uniform course of human events and to set at defiance the accumulated experience of ages. The causes of hostility among nations are innumerable. There are some which have a general and more consistent operation upon the collective bodies of society. Of this description are the love of power and the desire of preeminence and dominion, the jealousy of power, or the desire of equality and safety. There are others which have more circumscribed through an equally operative influence within their spheres. Such are the rivalships and competitions of commerce between commercial nations, and there are others, not less numerous than either the former, which take their origin entirely in private passions, and the attachments, enmities, interests, hopes, and fears of leading individuals in the communities of which they are members. Men of this class, whether the favorites of a king or of a people, have in too many instances abused the confidence they possessed, and assuming the pretext of some public motive, have not scrupled to sacrifice the national tranquility to personal advantage or personal gratification. The celebrated Pericles, in compliance with the resentment of a prostitute at the expense of much of the blood and treasure of his countrymen, attacked, vanquished, and destroyed the city of the Samnians. The same man, stimulated by private pique against the Megarenesians, another nation of Greece, or to avoid a prosecution with which he was threatened as an accomplice of a supposed theft, statutory failure, or to get rid of the accusations prepared to be brought against him for dissipating the funds of the state in the purchase of popularity, or from a combination of all these causes, was the primitive author of that famous and fatal war distinguished in the Grecian arrivals by the name of the Peloponnesians War, which, after vicious vicissitudes, intermissions, and renewals, terminated in the ruin of Athenian Commonwealth. The ambitious cardinal, who was prime minister to Henry VIII, permitting his vanity to aspire to the triple crown, entered hopes of succeeding in the acquisition of that splendid prize by the influence of the Emperor Charles V. To secure the favor and interest of this enterprising and powerful monarch, he precipitated England into a war with France, contrary to the plainest dictates of policy, and at the hazard of the safety and independence, as well as the kingdom over which he presided by his counsels, as of Europe in general. For if there ever was a sovereign who bid fair to realize the project of universal monarchy, it was the Emperor Charles V, of whose intrigues Wolsey was at once the instrument and the dupe. The influence which the bigotry of one female, the petulance of another, and the cabals of a third had in the contemporary policy, ferments, and pacifications of a considerable part of Europe are topics that have been too often descanted upon not to be generally known. To multiply examples of the agency of personal considerations on the production of great national events, either foreign or domestic, according to their direction, would be an unnecessary waste of time. Those who have but a superficial acquaintance with the sources from which they are to be drawn will themselves recollect a variety of instances, and those who have a tolerable knowledge of human nature will not stand in need of such lights to form their opinion either of the reality or extent of that agency. Perhaps a reference tending to illustrate the general principle may with propriety be made to a case which has lately happened among ourselves. If Shays had not been a desperate debtor, it is much to be doubted whether Massachusetts would have been plunged into a civil war. But notwithstanding the concurring testimony of experience, in this particular, there are still to be found visionary or designing men who stand ready to advocate the paradox of perpetual peace between the states, though dismembered and alienated from each other. The genius of republics, say they, is pacific. The spirit of commerce has a tendency to soften the manners of men, and to extinguish those inflammable humors which have so often kindled into wars. Commercial republics, like ours, will never be disposed to waste themselves in ruinous contentions with each other. They will be governed by mutual interest and well-cultivated spirit of mutual amity and concord. Is it not, we may ask these projectors in politics, the true interest of all nations to cultivate the same benevolent and philosophic spirit? If this be their true interest, have they in fact pursued it? Has it not, on the contrary, invariably been found that momentary passions and immediate interest, more active and imperious control over human conduct than general or remote considerations of policy, utility, or justice? Have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies? Are not the former administrated by men as well as the latter? Are there not aversions to predictions, rivalships, and desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations as well as kings? Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the impulses of rage, resentment, jealousy, avarice, and of other irregular and violent propensities? Is it not well known that their determinations are often governed by the few individuals in whom they place confidence, and are, of course, liable to be tinctured by the passions and views of these individuals? Has commerce hitherto done anything more than change the objects of war? Is not the love of wealth as domineering and enterprising a passion as that of power or glory? Have there not been as many wars founded upon commercial motives since that has become the prevailing system of nations, as were before occasioned by the cupidity or territory or dominion? Has not the spirit of commerce, in many instances, administered new incentives to the appetite, both for the one and for the other? Let experience, the least fallible guide of human options, be applied to for an answer to these inquiries. Sparta, Athens, Rome, and Carthage were all republics, two of them, Athens and Carthage, of the commercial kind. Yet they were often engaged in wars, offensive and defensive, as the neighboring monarchies of the same times. Sparta was little better than a well-regulated camp, and Rome was never sated of carnage and conquest. Carthage, though a commercial republic, was the aggressor in the very war that ended in her destruction. Hannibal had carried her arms into the heart of Italy and to the gates of Rome before Scipio, in turn, gave him an overthrow in the territories of Carthage and made a conquest of the Commonwealth. Venetia, in latter times, figured more than once in wars of ambition, till becoming an object of the other Italian states. Pope Julius II found means to accomplish that formidable league, which gave a deadly blow to the powers and pride of this haughty republic. The provinces of Holland, till they were overwhelmed in debts and taxes, took a leading and conspicuous part in the wars of Europe. They had furious contests with England for the dominion of the seas, and were among the most persevering and most implacable of the opponents of Louis XIV. Think about what's being said here, folks. In the government of Britain, the representatives of the people compose one branch of the national legislature. Commerce has been for ages the predominant pursuit of that country. Few nations, nevertheless, have been more frequently engaged in war, and the wars in which that kingdom has been engaged have, in numerous instances, proceeded from the people. There have been, if I may so express it, almost as many popular as royal wars. The cries of the nation and the importunities of their representatives here have, upon various occasions, dragged their monarchs into war, or continued them in it, contrary to their inclinations, and some contrary to the real interests of the state. In that memorable struggle for superiority between the rival houses of Austria and Bourbon, which so long kept Europe in a flame, it is well known that the antipathies of the English against the French, seconding the ambition, or rather the avarice, of a favorite leader, protracted the war beyond the limits marked out by our sound policy, and for a considerable time in opposition to the views of the court. The wars of these two last mentioned nations have in great measure grown out of commercial considerations. The desire of supplanting and the fear of being supplanted, either in particular branches of traffic or in the general advantages of trade and navigation. From this summary of what has taken place in other countries whose situations have become the nearest resemblance to our own, what reasons can we have to confide in those reveries which would seduce us into an expectation of peace and cordiality between the members of the present Confederacy in a state of separation? Have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of those idle theories which have amused us with the promises of an exemption from the imperfections, weaknesses, and evils incident to society in every shape? Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as the other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue? Let the point of extreme depression to which our national dignity and credit have sunk, let the inconveniences felt everywhere from a lax and ill administration of government, let the revolt of a part of the state of North Carolina, the late menacing disturbances in Pennsylvania, and the actual insurrections and rebellions in Massachusetts declare. So far as the general sense of mankind from corresponding from the tenets of those who endeavored to lull sleep, our apprehensions of discord and hostility between the states, in the event of disunion, that it has from long observation of the progress of society become a sort of axiom in politics, that vicinity or nearness of situation continues nations' natural enemies. An intelligent writer expresses himself on this subject to the effect, "Neighboring nations," says he, "are naturally enemies of each other unless their common weakness forces them to league in a confederate republic, and their constitution prevents the differences that neighboring occasions, extinguishing that secret jealousy which disposes all states to aggrandize themselves in the expense of their neighbors. The passage, at the same time, points out the evil and suggests the remedy." Enough for now. Peace out, all.